And it is something that we are trying to get in touch with this year with our theme of seeking the mind of Christ. Today, in the liturgical calendar, is the day that we mark the baptism of Jesus. It's that time when Jesus, at the very beginning of his ministry, unknown to anyone at that point, comes to his cousin John out in the Judean wilderness to be baptized. And John looks at him and says, No, you should be baptizing me. And Jesus says, Suffer me, allow me to be baptized, because this has to be done so that all things can be fulfilled. And you may have asked yourself, what is that about? Why would Jesus be getting baptized in the first place? If we think about Jesus and we think about Jesus' relationship with God, it was so that all things might be fulfilled. What happened in those murky waters of the Jordan, those muddy waters of the Jordan, was nothing less than God's reclaiming of creation. Something that maybe nobody at the time actually realized. You know, we live in a water world. We have lots of it outside today in the form of snow. We don't think of it as water. But of course, any farmer here, and I know there are some farmers here, will know that in the spring we'll need that snow as it melts off and as it irrigates the fields that grow our food. And maybe it's because we are terrestrial creatures, that we live on land, that we don't think of ourselves as living on a water world. The scripture tells us that in the beginning all there was water. That water was the medium of creation. That God called forth the land and then everything else from the deep waters that covered the face of this planet. Water is everywhere in our world. 72%, almost 3/4 of the surface of this planet is covered by water. Only 1/4 is the land where we live. There's water vapor in the atmosphere. There's water under the ground. Some of you may realize, some of you may not, that under the ground we have lakes and streams, even under this city. It's a little hobby of mine. I love to actually do a little urban archaeology and find out where the old stream beds are, where we still have streams flowing underneath the cities that we've built. And even below that, kilometers and kilometers and kilometers below, scientists say that we have hydrogen water in the mantle of the earth, the waters below and the waters above. There is water everywhere on this planet. In fact, it's kind of like a ball of water floating in space, really, because the land, the rock, all of the rest of it is such a small part of this planet. And we too are water. We came from the sea that day when our very ancient ancestors first crawled out of the oceans and onto the land. Still to this day, 65% of our body is water. You can't be a human being without water. 65%. If you take that away, all we are is a few ounces of dry elements. It's like we're a little bubble of water, a little vessel of water, walking around here on the land. Without water, there is no life as we know it. There may very well be other forms of life in other places, life constructed in different ways, but the life that we know is based on water, and the only place where we find the kind of water that we need for that life is right here on earth. And so Scripture tells us that at the beginning of creation, God looked down over the waters. The Spirit went forth, and God drew out creation from the deep waters of the earth. And maybe we can look at that symbolically. If you want to look at it literally, I guess you can. I prefer to look at it symbolically. This idea that we are born of water, that everything in this world comes from the life-giving source of water. And God looked at that. God looked at what God had created and said, "It is good. It is good." Water is one of the greatest blessings that we have. It is, in fact, the original blessing of life on this planet. It's what allows life to happen. I want you to think for a minute about our relationship with water today. It's not something that we think all that often about. But the waters of this planet are not in such great shape. We live in a world that at the beginning of this 21st century, where we have vast areas of the ocean which are dead space because of what we've done. We live in a world where we build facilities to power our homes and our cities that produce waste that is toxic to life. And then just north of here, we say, let's bury that waste only a few kilometers from the largest source of fresh water in the world. It'll only be around for 500 or 1,000 years or so. Surely there won't be any problems. I want you to think today about what we have done to God's blessing of water. We flushed out our sinks and our toilets, tiny little bubbles of plastic from our shampoo, so that our hair looks smooth and flowing. And you think, well, come on, that's not that big a deal. But if you have a few billion people doing that every day, you have a lot of little bits of plastic going into the source of life on this planet in an ingestible way that gets put into the food chain that has consequences that we actually don't even really fully understand. We might laugh about saying maybe someday the government's going to tax breathing and we'll have to pay for air. But you know what? We don't even think about buying cases of water voluntarily in little plastic bottles that will be around forever. Why do we in fact pay for the most plentiful substance on earth? God's original blessing has been marred by human greed, human power, human desire to master all things. The original blessing of water is in need of some restoration. But you know, that's not the only original blessing. Because out of that water and out of that creation, God created woman and man. And God looked at us and said, "It is good." Water, too, is a symbol of spiritual evolution. It is a symbol of our spiritual development. Throughout the Bible, we see it in the baptism that we read about today, but also in the Old Testament as a medium for blessing and purifying. We see it as a symbol of liberation as the Israelites are led out of Egypt through the parting of the waters, as they're led into the promised land across the waters. Waters bless us and restore us. So what happened in Jesus' baptism? Why was Jesus baptized on that day in the muddy waters of the Jordan. It was a reclaiming of creation more than anything else. It was the beginning of a new relationship of human beings with God and with this earth. It was the reclaiming of that original blessing. We think of original sin more often than original blessing. You know, I've always struggled a bit with this idea of original sin. I think it has more to do with our perception, with the way we think about God and look at God, than the way that God actually looks at us. It's because of our shame, because of our fear, because of our own projections about what God must be like, that we say, surely God can't stand to be around us. We were created somehow faulted. That explains what all of this is about. But what God says at the dawning of creation and what Jesus says in the Jordan is no. God is claiming this world, and God is claiming you as good and beloved. What happened in the Jordan is the beginning of a new way of being. Whatever happened in those intervening centuries, it is God showing up and saying, I am back and I want my creation and I want my created. I want them to live in that original blessing, in that image in which I created them. I want them to live in the way that I created them to live. I want them to know that they are beloved, that they are to live with a spirit in them, shaping them like a river shapes its banks. What happens in the Jordan at Jesus' baptism is God's recreation of the earth. Christ is the model for us. Christ shows us what it is like when a human being lives right in that original blessing, lives in that connection with God, with that connection of spirit. And Christ says that that is what we as his followers are called to do. Christ comes to John and says, I will be baptized. And John says, no. And Jesus says, but it must be so that all things will be fulfilled. God will reclaim this earth, and God will reclaim us. God will have us living in that original blessing that we were created to be in. This year, as we seek the mind of Christ, it seems like a good place to start. At the dawning of creation, when God looked on all that he had drawn out of the waters, when God looked at the created world, looked at you and me, and said, it is good. You'll notice that there's some similarities. You'll notice that at the beginning, we have the Spirit moving over the water, and as Jesus goes into the Jordan, he comes up out of that muddy water, and the Spirit descends. And what does God say? You are my beloved. And I'm telling you that God doesn't just say that to Jesus 2,000 years ago, but God says it to us today. If we are to claim that blessing, and if we are to be part of God's reclamation of this world, then we need to start by knowing that we are beloved. We need to trade original sin for original blessing. We can choose to be part of God's restoration of creation. We can choose to be part of God's restoration of humanity. And as we begin this year here at St. Andrew's, we can choose that as a community, and we can choose it as individuals. My question for you today is what will you choose? Is this what we are about as a community? Or is it something else? Because I'll tell you, reclaiming creation, reclaiming the image of God within us, is something that I think is pretty fantastic. If the church is not about that, then what are we? We could be a place that opens ourselves to living waters, that shape us and mold us, and shape and mold the community around us until we are a font of living waters. And people say, that's a place where I want to be. Because there's something happening. Today, as we seek the mind of Christ, as we remember Christ's baptism, let us think about what that means. Can you set aside the shame? Can you set aside the fear? Can you set aside whatever it is that keeps you thinking, I'm over here and God's up there? Can you see yourself in those waters? Can you see that Spirit descending? Can you hear God saying to you, you are my beloved? Because that's where the mind of Christ starts. And that is what we, as his followers, are called